Father, for your many blessings to us, we pause to give you the thanks that is due you. We thank you for the day that is ahead of us, for what's already been accomplished. May we have your strength, your guidance, so that what we do will be lasting and will be meaningful. For there's so many things that demand our attention, but there are only a few things that are necessary. So help us to order our priorities in such a way that what is needed will be accomplished. Help us to redeem the time that you have given us and make use of the energy and the guidance so that your kingdom will be established and will grow and others will come to know you. Thank you for the opportunity of being your children and of receiving from you everything that is needed. Thank you in Christ's name. Amen. Yes. Dr. Chappell mentioned that he was having a meeting, I think it was last Friday, where the Dean's Council, Dr. Hamilton, was supposed to challenge them to have all of our faculty work closely with the bookstore and not recommend to our students that they buy books elsewhere. Well, he can talk as much as he wants, but I can't bring myself to that point. I've been around too long to know the way the bookstore works, and if you can get them cheaper someplace else, that's fine. And you can. Now, a good illustration. A couple of years ago, Dr. Irvin published a new book on the Holy Spirit. And there was a guest that came to campus, so he sent a student over to the bookstore to get it. And it was $3 more than the retail price. And when he saw that, he blew up. I can see it, maybe charging the retail price. But when they add on more than that, there's just no reason for it. Because you generally have a markup of 50% or 40%. Even in the lease markup, it's 20%.
Who controls that markup, though? I know I'm going
If there happens to be Bibles especially that you need, I can generally get them for you much cheaper. And oftentimes, if you have books that you need from Zondervan, I can get at least 40% off for you on those. Let me know. Now, we want to talk about the birth of the monarchy today. Last time we took a look at the judges. And one of the things running through the judges was there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Then at the end of the book of Judges, we have these appendices. And one of them was the atrocities committed at Gibeon. Now keep that in mind as we find a king for Israel. We go to 1 Samuel for the beginning of the monarchy and the birth of Samuel. Now we're skipping over the book of Ruth. Perhaps I ought to take that before we get to Samuel, because that also is like an appendix. In the last part of Judges, you have the story of the tribe of Benjamin at Gibeon. And Saul is from Gibeon. Then you have the book of Ruth, and that's the background for David. And so you have these two that are sort of weighted against one another. The background of Saul, the background of David. But in Samuel, there is a woman by the name of Hannah who has been barren. she has a rival to her husband, Penina, who has several children. Hannah has prayed that she would have children. So far, she's had none. They go up every year to Shiloh, where the ark is located, and they have a celebration, one of these sacrifices where you take part of it and you have a sacrificial meal. Hannah always gets a double portion from her husband, but her rival gets something for herself and for each of her children. And this annoys Hannah. So she prays that if God will give her a son, she will give him back to the Lord. Eli, who was the priest at that time, is watching Hannah. He notices that her lips are moving, but there's no sound. So he figures she's drunk and accuses her of this. And then she explains the situation, and then he blesses her and asks that God would grant what she has asked. And this is what happens. She gives birth to a child. She names him Samuel. God has heard. Shema El. Samuel. When the child is weaned, old enough to take care of himself, Hannah brings him to the shrine at Shiloh, where Eli is, and there she leaves him to serve in the temple. Now, when I say temple, it looks like there was a permanent building of some kind, because it has doors that can be opened and closed. But it's certainly not the temple that later was built at Jerusalem. While Samuel is very young, he receives a call from God in an audible way. At least he believes he hears someone calling him, and he thinks it is Eli. This happens 3 different times, and each time he runs to Eli, and Eli then perceives that it is God who is speaking to Samuel, so he tells him if he calls again, just reply, and then God spoke to him. The message that he gave was a message of condemnation for the house of Eli. His sons were not following in his ways. In fact, his sons were wicked. We see this in the 2nd chapter, verse 22. Eli was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may meditate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. That's an interesting comment, isn't it? Where is that from? That's in chapter 2, verse 25. There's several little comments like that throughout the Old Testament. They didn't listen because the Lord wanted to put them to death. It's almost like that hardening of the heart of Pharaoh. Pharaoh hardened his heart, yet at the same time God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It may be cultural. This question came up in the other class. They were with us last Tuesday and had their Bible course. They had 6 students in there, and one of them was a Japanese student. And this is a question that he keeps raising because of his culture, children don't disobey their parents. So he was wondering, why is it? And there may be several things. Children may not have had any close contact with the parents, with the father. Children were raised by their mother, but this still does not excuse the So if you have a good father, you have a bad son. And if you have a bad father, you have a good son. In some cases, it may be where you are talking about kings, that the son is not reared with the father at all. One illustration of this, when the house of Ahab is wiped out, Jehu sends to Samaria, and there are 70 sons of Ahab who are being reared by the people at Samaria. It doesn't look like they're in the king's house at all, but nobles are raising them. So in that case, there may not be a contact at all with the king.
That was not the question whether the son was raised in David or not. Who's his father and
when Absalom flees after killing Amnon because of that, and then he comes back, Joab gets him back. David won't even see him for 2 years. He lives in the city of Jerusalem, and David refuses to see him. That's pretty good father-son relation. I'm not sure just what it is that is going on here where there seems to be no continuity between a good father and his son. We see the same thing with Samuel. His 2 sons who cause the people to ask for a king because they're not following in the way of Samuel.
We look at modern day right now in the rise of gangs, our community, not only gangs in certain areas, but gangs throughout the world. Different countries. After we saw a female household. From what you can see, I don't need to start nevertheless, I saw a scene that fits to what you're explaining.
There is no model for the child.
I was thinking also, if there's something that the fathers are not doing, I mean, to the point of like when disobedient child rises up, she's supposed to be listening to that person. She's supposed to take total authority. I mean, it's something that he can do because he still has an opportunity to adjust himself, whether he's humble himself, whether he's taking authority, whether he's compromised. But if there's something where he is possibly failing that child and not being able to, even right now, take control of the situation, that rebellious child is still searching for to try to balance himself.
Yeah, most children rebel because they sense a lack of love on the part of the parents. Whether there's a lack of love or not, sensing of a lack of love. There is a very good book out called How to Really Love Your Child, and another sequel, How to Really Love Your Teenager. And he stresses in there that if the emotional tank of the child is filled, there's no problem. It's when there's neglect of some kind that the child then attempts to get this attention through deviant behavior. And there's a lot to that. One of the basic needs that we have in our society today is for Christian men to go into public education in the first and second and third grades. Now, we don't have men there, but that's where we need them because they need a father figure. Most of the time, teachers in the lower grades are females, and so the child never sees a male that they can use as a model. The prophecy that comes against the house of Eli because of these 2 wicked sons involves a comment in verse 34 of chapter 2 that Hophni and Phinehas will be a sign. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. That priest that he's going to raise up is Samuel. Now, Samuel comes from Ephraim. Samuel is not from the tribe of Levi. He is the firstborn son of Hannah, so that does qualify him for priesthood. Because before the tribe of Levi was chosen, it was always the firstborn in the household that served as a priest. So in that way, you can say, well, yes, he is eligible, but he's not from the tribe of Levi. Then the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel is told, this prophecy is not from Samuel, I'm sorry. I was thinking that came through Samuel. It does not. It just says the man of God came to Eli and told him that. Then we have the call of Samuel. And basically the same thing is told to Samuel. The guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. And then we move from there to a battle that takes place with the Philistines at Aphek. Now, Aphek is not very far from Shiloh. It's in the hill country. Or Aphek is on the coast, but Shiloh is in the hill country. It doesn't show too much here because not too much of the map is visible. But here's the Dead Sea, and this would be Jerusalem. I don't see this Jerusalem here. Oh, there it is. It is Jerusalem. And Shiloh is in the hill country. Aphek is on that main coastal route that runs through the plain. That's where the Philistines are, and that's where they meet the Israelites. And in the first battle, Israel is defeated. So they get their heads together and they decide if they send to Shiloh and bring the ark from there, that will force God into the battle. So they bring the ark. The ark is captured by the Philistines. There is a route that the ark takes. They go first to Ashdod, which is near the seacoast, then to Ekron, and to Gath, then to Ekron. And every place the ark goes, there is pestilence that comes upon the people. When they start to take it to Ekron, the people of Ekron don't want it. And they call in their priests and their diviners and decide they need to send it back. And that's when the ark is returned to Israel. But the capture of the ark also means the death of Hophni and Phinehas. So the messengers came back to Shiloh that Hophni and Phinehas were dead. No problem. Eli was aware this was going to happen, so that didn't affect him. But when they mentioned that the Ark of the Covenant had been captured, he fell off from the seat that he was on, and he broke his neck and died. Aphek, A-P-H-E-K. Aphek. It's, I'm trying to think what the modern site was. There is a large spring at Aphek today. It's the source of the Yarkon River, where it begins and then flows from there to the Mediterranean. When the wife of Phinehas hears of the death of her husband and the capture of the ark, she gives birth to a son and names him Ichabod, which is, where is the glory? Because she says the glory, that is the ark, has been captured. Well, Samuel becomes the leader of the people, and there are occasions when he intercedes for them and defeats the Philistines. For instance, in chapter 7, there is an assembly at Mizpah by the Israelites, and when the Philistines learn of it, they come to attack Israel. Samuel prays, and God sends thunder and lightning, and this is enough to destroy the Philistines. You have a unnatural scene where normally you do not have thunder at that time of year, and so that in itself is frightening. And if the Philistines are not used to the mountains, thunder in the mountains can be scary. In fact, we had your wife yesterday, Robert, last night, to say that one of the neighbors had asked her, or one of the girls at work had asked her if she had heard that thunder yesterday morning. And nobody slept right through it. But this other woman had heard it, and it frightened her. And just about that time there was a flash of lightning that momentarily took their lights off. And everything went black. And so she was really scared, thinking maybe this was it. The trumpet had blown. So lightning or thunder can be frightening, and this is what happened here. And God defeated the Philistines by that means. That's when Samuel took a stone and set it up and named it Ebenezer, the stone of help. Help. We are told also at the end of chapter 7, in verse 16, from year to year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also judged Israel. Samuel acts as a judge as well as a priest. And he has this circuit that he makes every year. And you might keep that in mind, that circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah and back to Ramah. I like geographical questions like that. Bethel Bethel, Mizpah, Gilgal, and Ramah.
With Samuel being a priest, not being out of the Levite tribe, does that sort of point to Jesus being the priest, not being out of the Levite tribe?
It would. The only thing that Hebrews takes it back to Melchizedek for obvious reasons. But yes, that would be a case in point that you do not have to be from the tribe of Levi to serve as priest. Samuel would be a good example. Just that Melchizedek is back there, and we don't know as much about him, so he serves as a better example. We know too much about Samuel. Chapter 8, Israel asks for a king. So if they want a king, let's give them a king. Did God want them to have a king? No. Why is it that God said to Abraham, kings will come from Sarah? It looks like it's in God's plan that there be a king, but this may not have been the right time for it. But that may be the problem. They are wanting a king because Samuel's sons have failed. He had appointed them as judges in Beersheba, and they were taking bribes and perverting justice. So the people said, well, if this is the way it's going to be, we just as well have a king, like all of the other peoples. And so they asked for a king. Samuel doesn't want to give them a king. In fact, he won't call the leader king. He calls him a Nagib. And a Nagib is leader. Melech is king, and he uses Nagib. We have several ways in which Saul is chosen as king. There are at least 3 stories concerning the choice. First of all, Samuel is at Ramah, when Saul arrives. Saul has been out looking for some lost animals. They haven't found them. His servant who is with him suggests they go to Samuel, who is a seer, and he can tell them where the animals are. Saul doesn't have any money, but his servant has half a shekel, and they feel that would be enough. So from that you can guess that the seer is paid for his service. I don't know how some of these other people made their living, those who are prophets, whether they were paid for the prophecies or not. When Saul came to Samuel, God tells him, this is the one that you are to anoint king. Secretly, Samuel anoints Saul. Soon after this, there is a gathering of all the people at Mizpah. They draw straws to see who's going to be king. They do it by selecting the tribe, and then the clan, and then the family, and then the individual. Now we call that doing it by lot. And you can do it with straws. Any number of ways you can do this. You can have each of the tribal members draw a straw. You can put the name of each tribal member in a basket and shake it until one falls out, and whichever one falls out, that's the proper one. You can take a coin and flip it. Now this really is the Urim and Thummim in the Old Testament. You have two stones of some kind, or some kind of instrument, one perhaps with both of them two-sided, with a dark side, light side. And if both of them come up light, that's yes. Both of them come up dark, that's no. If it's light and dark, that's no answer. And so you can do the same thing with a coin. And I've done this on occasion. Students come in, want to know what class shall I take? And is this class or that class? And I says, would you like to use the Urim and Thummim? So I take out a coin, we flip it, and that's it. Why not? What they're doing here is that God is directing the outcome. And so whatever way is done, God is seen behind it. And when finally Saul is chosen, they can't find him because he's hiding. And then when they do find him, then he is proclaimed king.
How was he that?
He's modest, shy.
Okay, God contacted him, and then he knew that he was the chosen one.
No. Well, Samuel had anointed him prior to this.
God came to Samuel.
Yes, it was
Prior
prior.
to Samuel that he was the one.
That's right.
And they also chose him in the selection process.
Yes.
But when they got ready to choose him, they couldn't be found. So
That's right. He was hiding with the baggage.
That leads me to another question here as far as God being able to say is one that controls everything. And we look, say, back at Eli's two sons, say with Samuel, and as far as everything that they were doing, and when they turned and they lost the ark, and Eli finds the information that the ark is taken, so he breaks his neck. So I'm wondering the oddity and the piece of Eli is a man of God. He served God. God revealed things to him, and why didn't God reveal to him that the ark was going to return as a result of these other people catching a lot of diseases and other different things and so forth? So why would God allow Eli, one of his people, to die a broken neck and knowing that the ark is going to be returned? Why couldn't this thing be given to Eli? What was God's purpose in eliminating Eli?
I guess because he served his purpose.
And I guess the other part also would have been say that it was Samuel on the scene and to possibly just take away the worshiping of other gods also to be established through Samuel. This gets to the other question on this. What was Samuel's two sons? Samuel was judge. He had two sons. He appointed them judges. They both died, and so this is why the Israelites complained, and they wanted a king. Okay, so what was Samuel's two sons' names? The one that took the bride.
I don't recall now if their names. I think they are. Yeah, Joel and Bud. First was the anointing by Samuel, and then this one is by Lot, and then it's going to be a third, and that's in chapter 11. He's gone home, and he goes about his work just like he was before. But in Jabesh Gilead, remember over there in Transjordan, that city that was wiped out so they could find wives for the tribe of Benjamin, it is now being threatened by Nahash, an Aramean, or Ammonite, I guess he is. And these people are trying to find someone that will help. But they have agreed with Nahash, if they can't find someone to help them by a certain time, they will surrender to him. Then the right eye of every person will be gouged out. They'll become his slaves. So they send to Saul. And when Saul hears this, he is out plowing behind his oxen. Now that's what he should be doing. In the Gilead, when the men are summoned to go to war against Troy, they're out plowing. There are several cases of this. In ancient Sumer, in Ur, there was a standard. It's called the Standard of Ur. And on one side is a war scene. And on the other side is a domestic scene with a person plowing. So normally you plow, but in wartime you go to war. And so Saul here is out plowing when the message comes. He takes his oxen and cuts them into pieces and sends them throughout Israel, telling the people if they do not respond and come to the rescue of Jabesh Gilead, that their oxen will end up the same way. So they come. They assemble at Bezek, which is on the way to Transjordan. This is where Saul is, at Gibeah, rather. Bezek is here, and they're going to have to cross over to Jabesh Gilead. So that is the rally point. So from there, they cross over. Saul divides his men into three companies. They attack Nahash by surprise and free the city of Jabesh Gilead. When Saul comes back, they confirm the kingship on him again. He has now demonstrated an ability to lead. And so this could be the third time when he is chosen as king. Then Samuel gives a farewell message, which really is not a farewell message. He has great difficulty stepping out of the picture at this time. I see a lot of conflict between Samuel and Saul. Samuel has been leading the people up to this time. Now a king has been chosen. But Samuel is reluctant to turn over all power to Saul. The people agree that Samuel has not done anything that he should not. He has not taken anything that he shouldn't. So they're satisfied with him. They just don't like the prospects of his sons. In chapter 13, there's an interesting beginning to that chapter. You won't notice it because the way the text is filled in some numbers. It says Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. No, that isn't what the text says. The text says Saul was a year old when he became king. And when he had reigned over Israel 2 years, he chose 3,000 men. Of course, he is a child prodigy. If at the year of one, he can be king, and a head taller than everybody else at 1 year of age. But the Hebrew text doesn't have a number. Cyrus Gordon thought perhaps we have here something that is similar to the epic style in Lydia, where King Minos becomes king, I think it's at 6 or 7 years of age. So that Saul, who would be greater than Minos, became king at 1 year of age. That sort of thing. It may be that the number is just lost, but the 30 and the 40 have been put in there just as guesses of what it might be. And there is no evidence for that, excepting a few late Greek manuscripts for the number. You would have to have an ability to lead, to do that. This would be evidence of a charismatic leader, one who can get others to assist him. So it does show a quality about Saul. And Saul is, for the most part, Saul is a good king. It's just unfortunate that he has a mental problem when David comes on the scene. But other than that, he does good for his people.
Sir, at the time, I say two things that turned God against Saul was two things that he had did for himself and getting back to what you were seeing that he was having a problem with Samuel and the kingship and turning over the various properties because one of the first things that Saul did was the sacrifice, rather than wait for Samuel to do it, he in turn did it himself. And so God was displeased with that as one of the reasons. And then the second part, he in turn said that he repented because of Amalek. So Samuel had told him that God wanted Saul to kill Amalek, and he refused to do that. So those were the two things he went ahead and rather than waiting for Samuel, he did sacrifice. Saul did it himself, so God was displeased with that. Saul was supposed to kill Amalek. He refused to do it, so God then repented that he had made Saul king over Israel, and then he commissioned Samuel to go and fetch David. So here you sort of see the dichotomy of God knew that Saul wasn't going to work out, and he was still going to need somebody to go get David, and Samuel was the only person that could possibly be there, but it was still sort of
you could interpret it that way.
Set up
that Saul is sort of an example against which David should be measured. Saul failed, and so it makes David bigger than life because he succeeds.
And he was obedient.
Yeah, it's in chapter 13 that Saul makes that sacrifice. In verse 7, begins by saying some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. They were afraid of the Philistines, and so they weren't going to stay around. Then Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. When was it that Saul was told to wait 7 days? When he was anointed by Samuel, way back at the first. In chapter 10, verse 8, go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do. Right, now, if you will take these other 2 times when Saul is chosen as king by the assembly, which begins in chapter 8, or chapter 10, verse 9, and chapter 11, which is the rescue of the city of Jabesh, and then the farewell speech of Samuel, remove those, and these 2 passages fit together. But as it stands, we have a lot of events happening between the time that he was supposed to go to Gilgal and wait, and Samuel would arrive. So sometimes you don't make that connection. That's when it was that he was told. Now it looks like it's just a few days later, and he is at Gilgal. But in the meantime, Saul has rescued the city of Jabesh Gilead, and he has been chosen by acclamation of the people. He did wait 7 days. Yes, he did. And what was happening is that Saul was down here trying to rally his men, and they were sneaking off. He knew he had to offer the sacrifice. He waited for Samuel. Samuel was up on the hill with a pair of binoculars watching Saul. And then when Saul finally decided, I've got to do it, and he offers his sacrifice, then Samuel comes barreling down the hill and says, hey, I told you to wait.
And so that's why it seems like Saul was set up, and Samuel was competing the whole time to stay that favorite person with God, because the time that he was supposed to have been leaving, he didn't leave, and that was at the point when you were talking about he was supposed to wait. Saul was supposed to be, Samuel was supposed to have been departing, but he did not. And so for some reason or another, God's grace was allowing him to still hang around, even though Saul was supposed to have been in control.
We have another episode here of Jonathan. Yeah, okay.
It sounds like Samuel made it in 7 days if he got there right after the sacrifice was done.
Yes, yeah. But see, he just waited until...
Yeah, but he still made it within 7 days.
You're right, he did. He should have hung on just a little bit longer. He wouldn't have had any troops, but he should have hung on a little longer. Yeah. Now, after we have Saul failing in the sacrifice, we have this other incident that Willie mentioned, and that's his command to kill the Amalekites. The Amalekites were those who attacked Israel when they were on their way from Egypt to Canaan. God is going to get vengeance on them now, and he tells Saul that he is to wipe them out. Samuel goes looking for Saul when he has found that he has returned from this campaign, but Saul isn't there. Saul has gone to Carmel and there set up a monument for himself. Now, once you hear that, you know there's problems. Now, Carmel is not Mount Carmel. On this map, here's the Dead Sea. This is Jerusalem. Carmel is here. It's on the ridge route that goes to Arad. From Hebron to Arad, there's a site of Carmel. It's near Maon and Ziph. That's where later David is going to have trouble with Nabal at Carmel. When Saul comes back to where Samuel is, he reports that he has carried out what God told him to do. The question of the sheep that I hear. Saul thinks quickly and says, well, those are animals that the soldiers brought back. They saved the best of the animals to sacrifice them to your God. That is when Samuel says that obedience is better than sacrifice. And this is going to be characteristic of all of the prophets from this time on, that God wants obedience, He doesn't want sacrifice. And they will say it in different ways, but it boils down to that same thing. Samuel also tells him, this is chapter 15, verse 17, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, go and completely destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites. Make war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. For divination or idolatry are the worst possible sins. But that means that you are going away from Yahweh to other gods. Divination is appealing to a power other than Yahweh. And that's idolatry. And this rebellion is like that same sin. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command at your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel says, no, he's not going to go back. Saul grabs hold of his garment, and as Samuel turns, it rips it. And that is used as a sign by Samuel. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. But Saul again said, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. And so Saul agrees to this after he has put Agag to death. Agag is king of the Amalekites, whom they have captured. Samuel himself hacks him to death. Then Samuel left for Ramah. And Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again. So Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. That's what it looks like, that Saul is saying this to save face, rather than really being repentant for what he has done. And the action of Saul after this seems to indicate that he doesn't have the moral qualities that he needs to really make a commitment and hold to it. In the encounter with David, there are a couple of times that he has opportunities to change, but he doesn't do it. So we have Samuel sent to the house of Jesse to find another king. And here again, we have a principle that is demonstrated, and that is that God looks on the heart of the person, not on his outward appearance. When the sons of Jesse are brought in, the eldest son is the one that Samuel thinks should be king. But God said, no, he's not the one. Finally, they have to send out to the sheepfold to get David. He's not even there. And God says he's the one. And David is always described as a man after God's own heart. And that's what makes him qualified for kingship. David sins, there's no doubt about it. And he commits horrible crimes. But yet, when it is called to his attention, he always turns to God. One sin that David never committed was to go away from Yahweh. And that is important. Always was directed towards Yahweh.
I think one of the things that we went here too is that Saul's heart was never really come towards God. I mean, even the situation that Samuel, he delayed coming down on the second day. He his expectations really weren't going to be down because they were, despite his men, he was stayed there. So that just proves that his heart was never really, his expectations never really came to the Lord.
He does the best that he can within human expectations. He doesn't seem to have that extra help that he needs from God.
This goes back to the question, Dr. Hayden. Why did God choose him?
Choose Saul?
Choose Saul. When all of these things was going to be manifested, and he was aware of them being going to be manifested.
The people want a king. So God says, all right, here's a king. And the king proves to be less than desired. So it looks like he's saying, oh, okay, here's the king. But he's not the one that God would choose. So it's more of an example of, this is what a king is going to be like. If you want a king now, here's your king.
Well, is that sort of a confirmation of what Samuel was trying to convey to them?
It is.
That Israel should remain with God rather than desire the king. And
also, what we're seeing here too now, God had refused Saul, and at the point of when Saul was begging Samuel to go before the people to represent him, and he snatched and tore his gown. And then later, as he went on, changed his mind and did meet with Saul. Then, as he says in chapter 15, verse 35, until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again. So Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So it turns now that the Lord was grieved that Samuel changed his mind and made Saul king over Israel. It says it right here. So why didn't the Lord have control over Samuel at that particular point to keep him from making Saul king over Israel?
God is the one who told Samuel to anoint Saul.
The first time. Right.
But God controlled all of it.
Right. And then he comes back here now, here at the end of the chapter 15, it says, God was grieved. The first time, okay, good. The second time, when Saul turned and he worshiped idols, he was torn from Samuel. Samuel changed his mind, and then at that point, while Samuel had changed his mind in regards to Saul, why didn't the Lord touch Samuel, and why didn't God do something to Samuel for changing his mind?
Let me try to answer that with a question. And that is, has God ever given anyone something they wanted because they asked for it that was not best for them?
Which person are you talking about?
Anybody?
Yes. Now your question was what?
Has God ever given anyone something that was not best for them because they asked for it? God, give me this, give me that, and God says, all right, I'll give it to you. So we find out it wasn't best for them.
Yeah, David, when he got that shit.
Right, now this is the same situation here.
Yeah, but it wasn't best for him. God supplies everything.
Here they are wanting a king, and so God gives them a king, but that's not what is best for them. It would have been much better if they had waited and let God work it out on His terms. But as an answer to their request for a king, God says, all right, you can have a king.
But we also remember here in regards to that, God had agreed with them initially, but when Samuel, two sons, that he appointed judges, and they in turn took the bribes also, then the people of Israel rose up as a result of these two having, say, taking a bribe. Samuel was supposed to have been the most trusted prophet, and his two sons would have been the descendants, the same thing as an appointed king. So he appointed his two sons to be judges, and they turned out to be corrupt. So then the Israelite people then put the pressure and demanded that there be a king, and say change from the concept that they had before to put before God. They say turn it down, and then when he came around and corrupted, then they said, well, hey, we got to go back to having ourselves king. If the king is going to be all of these terrible things that you see, and these people say who is the judge's son and he's appointed is doing the same thing, what is the difference? And so that's when the Lord allowed them to have one with the son.
But it really wasn't best for them, was it?
No, it wasn't.
But they wanted it, so we let it happen.
And
I think there's a moral here. You see, there are times when we think we want something and we keep asking God for it, and He says, okay, you can have it, but it's not what it's best for.
Is that a part, well, that's disobedience in an indirect way, though, what you say?
Well, it's wanting our will rather than God.
Yes, and that's basically turning away from God, turning forward. So, in any case, them with their desire, what I'm saying is that because of their strong desire, even after God's strong warning through Samuel, telling them what would be the manifestations throughout time, he really went back and prophesied to them, just told them this is the way it's going to be. From this point on, once you make this decision, and they said, well, even after hearing all that, we still want a king. So at that particular time, they stood before God and said, well, we're turning away from the theocracy and turning to monarchy. Yes. Mm-hmm.
We also have to realize that God was building a lineage also. And David was chosen in his mother's womb to be in the will of God. We know this now, but of course they didn't realize all of that.
You know, something that keeps going through my mind is back in the garden at the exposure when it was prophesied, you know, in reference to the lady seed, and then we go come further over, and then there's Abraham, and then the prophetic, the promise of covenant agreement between God and Abraham, speaking forth what was going to eventually be manifested. So I still keep thinking about the omniscience of God and the omnipotence of God. Also intertwined with someone else that was never addressed, that was also in the garden, and was also continuously manifesting himself throughout the historical aspects of the Bible, and that's Satan himself, operating through different nations and also operating through different individuals. So I see a war there going on as well.
We don't have Satan really becoming a part in this historical material here.
Yeah, that's right. He's right. You know, it's never addressed. And I would imagine but when we get over the New Testament, then it's addressed by Jesus, and then we see Paul, and then when they reflect back, then they unfold those inner workings during that period of time. But then listening to you and also reading your sword, we see that historically, during those periods of time, there was back to progressive revelation, utilizing progressive revelation. Well, these people continuously confronted with where they are at the time in terms of the other tribes and tribal customs, and Israel was infiltrated with a bunch of those, and yet Yahweh is continuously trying to penetrate them to show himself through them, through a covenant agreement, but yet they're turning away doing the judges, and then he'll raise up another deliverer, and then the process goes on and on until they come to a king. So we do see those inner workings, even though they're not addressed, we see divination, we see sorcery, and etc. in there, and idolatry, child worship with respect to Jephthah. So we do see is not addressed by the writers, but we do see the manifestation of it based on our knowledge of the New Testament and what the apostle and Jesus Christ said. That's what I'm saying.
And we still have to discuss a conflict between Saul and David, and we're not going to have time to finish that. That is going to be a struggle for power. I wanted to mention to you that on Tuesday of next week, you have your first examination, and that will cover through Judges. It does not cover the material we discussed today. I will cover through Judges. And then on next Thursday, Dr. Schatzman will be with you to discuss the Golden Age, which will be David and Solomon. So that's next week.
You can get out of town all next week.
Is that our faith is based upon historical fact.
Amen.
What separates Christianity from Gnosticism is the fact that we're not talking about special revelation knowledge, but we're talking about a historical figure, the Lord Jesus Christ, who lived and died, suffered under Pontius Pilate, rose again to give life and help the people. There is a historical fact of Jesus coming. And Paul bases his message of the gospel upon the facts of Jesus' life and his preaching of that subject, the message of Jesus is contained in the Gospels. Well, I don't know how I can hold back the hands in the laundry. There's so many things going on. I'm trying hard Now, usually teachers have exactly the opposite. Without any question, everybody has a question.
There's still time.
I don't know what else I have to say. Okay, well, thank you. All right.
Well, I think your defense for the Jews is very interesting, but it's not really accurate with all the Gospels, because in Mark, it says that Pilate perceived that the chief priests had delivered him up out of envy, and there is also documentation that he had decided to release him, and it was the chief priests decided the people to go ahead and say, if you do this, you're more friend of Caesar, using his weakness there. And I have nothing against the Jewish people, and I think it's very important to see that it's the world rulers and the world authorities that come against Jesus Christ out of envy for his authority in the kingdom of God, not any particular national group, but it is always the conformity to this world rulers as opposed to the world rulers, the kingdom of God rulers. And this is wondering, I raised my hand also when you're talking about the Christ textbook, because I think this is what you have here, is a person who's being conformed to the world rulers. You have said a number of times that the Bible can stand up to any evidence, but I do not believe that Christ's textbook is evidence. It's a distortion of the evidence, and I have a very great difficulty reading it. He misinterprets the scriptures and seems to find delight in pointing out that the scriptures contradict one another when they don't. For instance, when he says that Acts 4 or Acts 2 contradicts Luke 4 about Jesus' reception of the Spirit, doesn't even know the difference between his reception of the Spirit for his own baptism and the reception of the Spirit in the church. And it's a mishmash after a while, and I feel really outraged when I read this book. And I identify with the Maccabees who got outraged at Antiochus Epiphanes destroying the holy things of God. And I really I can't read it. No, the Spirit in me is a spirit of truth, and this is not.
Well, I've got one question that's kind of hypothetical in a way. Tradition has always said that Jesus received 39 stripes, But I've always, they're basing that basically on the Jewish law, the 40 minus 1. But it was Pilate that actually put the scourging on Jesus. Now, I don't believe that the Romans were any way near to following the old Jewish law. So why does tradition always state 39 stripes?
Probably wrong, but because it is assumed that the Jews are responsible for actually crucifying Jesus. Christian tradition often puts the entire blame on the Jews, not only in that period, but on every successive generation. I agree with you. Now, there's a couple of things that are involved here. In my opinion, it's the high priest and maybe their guard. So the high priest had a police force in the group. And they may be the ones that actually go and arrest Jesus in his city. They have their counsel. And of course, I'm not saying there's no Jewish involvement in their trial of Jesus. When it goes to Pilate, when he said prophesied to us, there may have been some, this guard, read what the Talmud itself says. There's a big difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And the views of the Pharisees as opposed to the views of the Sadducees at this point. And some things happen in the temple that were very unholy in the treatment of prisoners and things like that. Prophesied to us. Pharisees believed in prophecy. Sadducees did not believe. The 39 stripes before the crucifixion of Jesus would not have been administered by the temple priesthood or the temple guard or family that would have come from the Romans. And their approach is to try to, they don't have the same limitations that would have been limited by the Jews. If anything, they probably would have been more brutal if they could have, they don't want the prisoner to die before execution. Apparently, Jesus was very harshly treated, brutally treated. According to Roman law, the prisoner should carry the cross. He wasn't able to carry it. Simon comes, black man, takes the cross for him and carries it the rest of the way. So it may be an indication for us that what it was a great deal of torture involved. I think that's a point well taken. Like that, we don't need to leave all this to movie makers, and there's a lot of other things that we have to read each one of these gospel accounts very, very carefully and think about to whom is he talking. And the tendency is to make it very general and universal, rather than to see here's his temple and where are they? They're back there. How it develops. All right, Scott is here. I've been holding him back, so I'm ready.
The point I wanted to make was on let us look upon us.
Yes.
I think a lot of problems in hermeneutics, and people tend to look at this when they're doing exegesis. There's a high possibility of doing eisegesis, and they're reading in theological meaning into a statement which is truly recorded, but which is not true. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that's not true, but it's truly recorded. I mean, and for instance, would be the counselors to Job. They say a lot of things, and when we read them, they look like they're wise sayings. But when we find out in the end, they weren't the truth. These are things truly recorded. And if we're trying to put theological, and look at something like that theological, it's not in it. It's truly recorded. And I think that's another possibility we need to look at in some of the statements, instead of trying to read meaning in everything we see.
It doesn't make sense. In a traditional Christian revelation, what somebody says, does that put a curse on it for the rest of their life? I would say, let this curse be in my whole children. Does that mean that God is going to hold every child? It doesn't make sense in the same thing. I think we have to really ask ourselves those kinds of questions. And sometimes the people say, well, the Nazis were the Nazis. We can't hold all the present judgments accountable for what the Nazis did. However, we should study history. We don't want to make the same mistakes that the people did at that time, and the Nazis did. A lot of people seem to make those same mistakes. All right, now we got two questions back here. We're going to take it with that one. Yes?
You mentioned that it was very possible a what is what we thought about John chapter 17? He was given careful act.
I wouldn't think that's right, because it's possible to think about it. Yet I think it seems more to the unity. At that time, when the organization was going into that kindergarten before 18. God, I'd have to think about that. That's a possibility. Certainly a prayer we can just say together, isn't it? One last question here.
In the gospel, in one of the gospels, before the Passover, Jesus said, and they asked him who would betray him. He said, whom did not give a stop. I read somewhere that this is supposed to be some kind of a mark of honor for the guest to receive. I guess it's an honor of having stopped this. Is this true?
You're saying that you think that is, again, I'm not sure if
Jesus said, they asked him who would betray you, and then he said, who would have to give a stop. And then he gave it to Judas. I read somewhere that this is supposed to be a mark of honor to the guest. Is that correct?
Yes, it's part of the Passover celebration, the parts that are done with the guests. We don't know everything about how the Passover was observed at that time. I'm not certain that we can say that it was marked by honor. It's possible. It's possible that the Passover is a remembering of this feast using elements of the table of food. It's very important. I wish everybody could have participants in the Passover. Well, it's been a good class. Thank you.
Thank you.